Hi, my name is Jay, and the traditional schooling model didn't work for me. So instead of finishing high school or going to university or college, I made a decision to travel the world for 10 years as an alternative vehicle for further education. As a part of that journey and what I'm currently learning, I've decided to learn the Spanish language. I've been living in Latin America this year, and after years of traveling, I decided I'm finally ready to learn a language. A big reason behind wanting to learn Spanish was to have just like a deeper experience of life itself, and to be able to interact with the places and people that I meet here in Latin America at a much more profound level, to go beneath the surface level experiences. I lived in Mexico City for the first 6 months of this year, and I was trying to sort of learn Spanish, and I was doing classes like almost every day online, but I just wasn't really learning. I was in and around people that just spoke English all day. I'm working in English, and so I didn't make a lot of progress despite doing like an hour a day of classes. So, the second half of this year I moved to Medellin in Colombia, and I was super determined to, go deep on the language. The journey of language learning has, it's something very new for me. I grew up in Australia where, most people, just speak English. Not many people, have a second tongue unless they were born somewhere else. We don't really have, a culture of that. In school, they don't really teach languages properly. Like there is language programs. Like I did like 6 months of Japanese, but I never was really taken on the language learning journey. And despite all my travel, I'd never been in like one place long enough that it was like worth learning a language. And so when I came to Latin America, it was like, okay, it's time. The Spanish language is probably the best or most worthwhile language to learn for an English speaker in this part of the world. And I could see, it's versatile to use across many different countries, not just one. So I pretty much, I arrived in Medellin about four months ago or 5 months ago, thinking I knew a bit of Spanish, but when I really started to dive into learning, I realized how little I really knew, despite 6 months of classes. So, hey friends, I'm here in Medellin, in Colombia, my new home for the next month or two. I'm settling in, and I'm excited to be going on a new journey today. Begins to getting serious about learning Spanish.
Cada día doy las gracias a esta vida.
I started an immersion program. I did like 4 or 5 hours a day every day for 30 days at it's called Baselang. I've been doing their classes online, so I went to their in-person school for 30 days straight, and it was all conversation driven. So no real grammar, no like flashcards of trying to memorize vocabulary, but just talking. So I sat down, this guy's name was Walter, and we spoke for 5 hours a day, every day, for a month. And that obviously like took my Spanish to a whole new level. I gained a lot of confidence, and I could have conversations after 30 days of 5 hours a day. I was pretty proficient in just like the basic conversations. But towards the end, probably like the last week of that, I just started to probably it's kind of stopped working. I stopped learning. We were running out of things to talk about, and I was just really limited by like vocabulary. It's like I knew how to speak, but I was just like, and because of my 6 months sort of early of learning, I had like an understanding of how the grammar worked, and I had some vocab. But then, after a month of that, I was kind of hitting like a bit of a roadblock. So I kind of stopped doing that school, and then started to look at other ways. So I got like a one-on-one teacher, and then moved to just doing like an hour a day with her at like a local cafe. But during this time, the biggest thing that I really dig was being immersed in like the culture. So I started seeing a girl and she didn't speak any English, so that, you know, obviously caused me to need to really learn. And I was boxing in local boxing gyms where there was no English spoken. And yeah, so it was very different to Mexico where I was living, where there are obviously a lot of Spanish speakers, but also there was just a lot more English. So, you know, I'd speak to people and it was just easier for them to speak to me in English than me to speak to them in Spanish. So anyway, yeah, over the next couple of months, I started seeing this other teacher, and then I really just started getting, you know, information online, started watching a lot of YouTube videos and started following some like language learning professionals or content creators, and then started to just like step away from lessons altogether and then just consuming content and then applying it in the real world up until now. So anyway, I wanted to like kind of share the best resources and lessons that I've learned over the last little while on my journey that I kind of wish I knew at the start, that I didn't expect, so I thought I would share that. So number one, grammar shouldn't be a focus. There's so many reasons behind why you shouldn't focus on grammar. It's quite a big waste of time, in my opinion. You don't enjoy it, it's not fun, and you're just trying to like memorize stuff, and it just didn't work for me. The time that I spent trying to learn grammar, it helped me understand the language a little bit, and it was useful to a certain extent, but yeah, I wouldn't focus on grammar if I was starting again. The next lesson is like I can do my best learning on my own. I don't need to have a teacher as such, or I don't need to spend so much time with a teacher. I probably wouldn't go back and do that 30 days of talking again. I think it was pretty inefficient use of time.
Estamos aquí en la Comuna 13 en Medellín. Es un lugar muy interesante, ¿no? Muchas diferentes cosas aquí, artes. Mucho arte. Y mucha música. Sí, me gusta mucho. ¿Y tú?
¿Qué me gusta de la Comuna 13?
Sí.
Las personas, o sea, ver cómo actúan, lo que hacen, cómo viven, porque entonces esto ya es una vivienda,
Exposure and time spent like with the actual language is everything. Just constantly consuming, the content of the language. I guess one of the biggest things I've learned through the process is that like language learning is like a native function of the human brain. It doesn't need to be forced. It doesn't need like a workbook. It doesn't need to be structured. It's what, you know, humans innately do. We're built to like learn languages. And so that leads me to my next point of my discovery of comprehensible input, which is like a learning style of Spanish, which pretty much is like finding content, starting from the most basic children's content in a language to like, you know, interviews with experts and just like slowly progressing and just being able to consume content at your exact level through like just the, you know, comprehensible input, the model. You just like innately learn the grammar, the vocab, the punctuation, the spelling, or not so much the spelling, but the sounds innately versus trying to memorize them through a textbook or through a lesson. And it was interesting, like in Colombia, the amount of people that I met that were fluent in Spanish or had in English, or had like, you know, reasonably good English enough to have good interactions. You know, they never studied English, they just learned through consuming content. And I thought that was very interesting compared to the people that I'd spent time with, like Westerners who had tried to learn language and spent so much time in classes and had like worse language learning experience or progress. My next kind of part of learning a language is I needed to not just learn how to learn Spanish, but I needed to learn about the process of learning languages in general, and just wrapping my head around the whole concept of like what it even means to learn a language. So that, you know, instead of just focusing on like, I need to learn Spanish and just putting all this effort into learning Spanish, I put just as much effort into learning about the process of learning languages, which allowed my time that I spent actually learning Spanish to be much better spent. And then eventually I was able to learn about how to learn languages in Spanish, so I was able to do like both at the same time. Another lesson was moving away from trying to like translate stuff for a number of reasons, as in like language is a lot more dynamic than just like this word equals this word in a certain language, but each word is very unique and will be different in a variety of different contexts. And also it like reinforces a habit in the brain of trying to like think in your native language rather than thinking in the new language. Yeah, it takes you out of being present to the language that you're trying to acquire. Another reason for not translating the language is when the way that we learn language is like through context. So when we learn a language, we need like the more context that is involved when we learn a new word, the more it sticks. But if you just take a word completely out of context and just translate it, it's like the chances of it actually, you know, being acquired into like long-term memory is very little. Yeah, my next point is like just like finding native content that I really enjoyed and I could understand and I loved. And so a lot of my time spent now learning languages is spending time finding content that's at my level and that I actually would just want to listen to in my own language. So it doesn't feel like I'm dedicating so much time to just learning Spanish, but I'm just listening to content that I'd probably listen to in English anyway, and that's interesting to me. And yeah, one of the other points of things that I learned is like the idea of like a technological immersion. So a lot of people, you know, the best way to learn is probably like through immersion, through going to the country. But then if you go to the country and then you're still consuming content all day in English, working all day in English, calling your family and friends in English, it's like, it's gonna be hard, you know, to learn. So a part of it was actually creating like a technological immersion as well, where I put all my technology into Spanish and then tried to, you know, just consume all content and interact with everything online in Spanish as well. So following Spanish Instagram accounts, on Twitter, podcasts, music, and just trying to create like a technological immersion, Netflix shows, reading books and like, you know, ebooks or whatever, and trying to create a technological immersion because we spend so much time you know, on screens, on devices. So making that Spanish as well was a huge part of the process. Some of the biggest challenges that I kind of encountered was, especially in Mexico, was when their English was better than my Spanish. They would just speak to me in English, which is super frustrating when you wanted to practice your language, you want to learn, and then as soon as you speak, they just start speaking back to you in English. That was like definitely a big challenge at the start. And obviously the better your Spanish gets, the more patience people are going to have, and the more willing they're going to be to speak to you in your own language, in Spanish, sorry. And then the more willing they're going to be to actually speak to you in Spanish, the better your Spanish gets. And then moving to Colombia was helpful for this because the people I was surrounded by there didn't know English for the most part. So there was, you know, they had more patience for me because they didn't know English. Yeah, and then like that leads to the next point of like, the biggest thing I think is like, you know, finding people that are patient enough to speak to you. And a lot of parts of the world, if they've got a bit of English, like they're just not gonna have the patience to speak to someone who's very slow. So that was definitely a challenge at the start when my Spanish wasn't very good. People didn't have a lot of patience to speak to me in Spanish. But that was one of the biggest differences between Mexico and Medellin. Yeah, another one of the challenges is like, especially at the start, was like really trying to force it. We're trying to like, and that's when I was going down the more grammar, memorization sort of path and really trying to force myself to learn a language. It just didn't work. And then another challenge is like, obviously Spanish is different in every country, and you know, phrases and words obviously change from place to place. So if I'm moving around, it can be frustrating if I'm like, I don't understand something because, you know, it's a very colloquial phrase or term or word from that particular part of the world. Amazing. So some of the best resources that I kind of came across on my journey, the biggest one was Dreaming in Spanish. I'm obsessed with the idea of comprehensible input, and that is like a path of learning languages. It pretty much is a series of videos, thousands of videos from the most basic Spanish that you can understand to, you know, advanced interviews and conversations. And that's probably been my number one resource on this journey. You know, and that's when I made my biggest gains, is just watching hours of those videos every day. Another great resource was Steve Kaufman and his app called Linked. He's an amazing polyglot. He's got like I think he's acquired something like 20 languages, or he can speak 20 languages. He knows like maybe 8 or 10 like super fluently. And he's got an amazing YouTube channel with so many resources about the journey of learning languages in English and Spanish and a bunch of different other languages. And he also wrote an amazing book about his journey of learning languages and has an app or website called Linked, which is, it's been amazing for my reading, which I've used a lot. Another cool resource is the Spanialistas podcast. It's an American guy and a Colombian girl. I think they're married, they live in Colombia, and they just have like conversations about different topics. And so listening to one person who's a native speaker and somebody who's a non-native speaker speak together was like, it's really, makes it a lot easier listening to a non-native speaker, but obviously you don't want to just learn from a non-native speaker. So hearing both next to each other was amazing for my listening. Another great resource was Ollie Richards' book, like Spanish for Beginners. Ollie's he's a polyglot as well, and he's written a bunch of books to acquire languages through reading. His book's been awesome. A bunch of short stories that kind of get gradually harder as you learn. It's got vocab, lists at the back so you can flick through at the end, which was cool. And then, finally Baselang, which I used more heavily at the start. I'm not using them anymore, but that was cool at the start just for the conversation. I did the month in Medellin at their school there and did a bunch of stuff online. Shout out to Juan who did my lessons with me online. He helped me a lot. And that was, it was a great resource, especially at the start, just to get me going. And then what I would do differently, sort of going, if I was to start again or when I learn my next language, would be, more input early on and focus on just like consuming content, and not so much of trying to like learn through grammar or learn words or vocab or Duolingo or anything like that, but just consuming content for hours a day. Secondly, just like trying to let go of trying to understand everything and being obsessed with needing to know every single word or understand every single sentence, and just like let the language come and let the language sort of like wash over me, and what I get, and just let go of needing to understand completely, because it doesn't help you understand. And then another thing that I would do next time, it's something I kind of discovered later on, which is called crosstalk. So it's a way of like learning languages where you find a partner who wants to learn your language and you learn theirs, and you pretty much both speak your mother tongue. And it's supposed to be a really good way of learning languages. And Valentina and I in Colombia, we started to do that towards my last couple of weeks, and it was amazing how much she understood in English, because she doesn't speak English. So, and then it was great for me to be able to just focus on my listening skills and not have to worry about my speaking skills. Help me understand more for sure. And so like my current level right now after like 4 months in Colombia is I'm like confident to have conversations with anyone about pretty much anything. Obviously there's huge gaps in my vocab. It takes a long time to fill in like a complete vocab, but I can express what I need to express, and I can understand somebody if they're willing to be fairly patient with me and not speak too fast, or well, even the speed's not too bad now, but if they're willing to be patient with me, we can converse, to a pretty high level. Where I'm probably like a little bit slower is for example, I went out on Friday night with some friends that were they all speak, Spanish. And I was the only non-Spanish speaker there, and they're, obviously yelling across the table, talking all night, and that's obviously a lot harder to follow for me, and that took a lot of effort, and I missed a lot of things. But as soon as I spoke to one person, I was fine. Sweet, so my plan for the future of my language learning is I want to continue with Spanish. Obviously, I'm not to the level where I'm like completely stoked yet. I want to get to like a very high level of Spanish. So I'm going to continue to focus on Spanish, keep living in Spanish-speaking countries, keep consuming, hours of Spanish content every day. And after that, I'd love to learn French and Italian and Portuguese, but at the moment it's just like, I want to, master Spanish. I don't want to just be like average at Spanish. I want to have really good Spanish. And then, a thought I have is like, if you learn, I've got a long life, and even just learn one language every 5 years, after like 50 years, that's 10 languages. And you know, the way that languages can be learned, if it's not like all about grammar and that old way of learning languages, where you're just like sitting in a classroom writing vocab out, and which doesn't really work. But if you're just consuming content, you know, a language every 5 years it seems very doable. And yeah, I you know, really enjoy the journey of learning a language. It's like a whole new way of, you know, experiencing life, and I even see the changes in myself, the way I express myself differently in a different language. And you know, it's not just words, a language, it's so much more. It's a whole way of expressing yourself. So I've really enjoyed that, and it's a whole new way of like interacting with people as well. And yeah, it's a whole new way of you know, it's a whole new way of being in the world in that new language. And it's opened up a lot of new things for me, and it's been super exciting. And you know, it's made travel like a million times more fun, and you know, it's made Latin America way more exciting. And I feel like, you know, without learning the language of a place, you only really scratch the surface of everything that culture has to offer. So yeah, it's been amazing.